James Henderson worked as an architect in a small but respected firm in Boston. At 32, he had a comfortable life with good friends, a nice apartment, and weekends filled with hobbies. But something was missing. His last relationship had ended a year ago, and since then, he'd focused on his career, designing buildings instead of building a life with someone. On a rainy Saturday in April, James's colleague convinced him to attend a charity auction for the city's Historical Preservation Society. James went reluctantly, more interested in the historic building than the event itself. Across the room stood Amara Wilson, a talented photographer whose work capturing Boston's changing neighborhoods had recently been featured in a local gallery. At 29, she balanced her artistic passion with practical work shooting weddings and family portraits. Her friend Tasha, one of the event organizers, had asked her to take photos for the charity's website. "You should really try the mini quitches," a voice said behind Amara as she adjusted her camera settings. She turned to find James holding two small plates. "Are you bribing the photographer?" she asked with a smile. "Just making a food recommendation," he replied, offering her one of the plates. "I'm James." "Amara, and I never turn down free food." What started as casual conversation by the refreshment table turned into an hour of talking about everything from their favorite buildings in Boston to childhood memories of exploring the city. They didn't notice the curious glances from other guests or the whispers that followed their laughter. "I grew up just 3 miles from your neighborhood," James said, surprised by the coincidence. "Yet we never crossed paths until tonight," Amara replied. "Funny how separate our worlds were." When the event ended, James helped Amara pack her camera equipment. Their hands brushed, and something as simple as that touch felt significant to both of them. "I'd like to see you again," James said plainly. "Maybe show you that bakery I mentioned on Commonwealth Avenue?" Amara hesitated for a moment. She looked around the room, noticing a few stares from the remaining guests. She had been in interracial relationships before and knew the challenges. But there was something about James that made her want to say yes despite her concerns. "I'd like that," she finally answered, entering her number into his phone. As they walked out together, Tasha pulled Amara aside while James waited by the door. "Really? The white architect guy?" Tasha whispered. "You know what you're getting into, right?" "We're just getting coffee," Amara replied, though she knew it would become more than that. Driving home that night, James couldn't stop smiling. He called his best friend Mark from his car. "Met someone interesting tonight," James said. "Yeah? What's she like?" Mark asked. "She's smart, funny, an amazing photographer. Her name is Amara." There was a pause before Mark responded. "Amara? That's an unusual name. What's her background?" James knew what his friend was really asking. "She's black, Mark. And before you say anything, yes, I know some people might have opinions about that." "Hey, I didn't say anything," Mark replied quickly. "Just be prepared for comments from others, that's all." James hung up a few minutes later, his earlier excitement dimmed. But as he thought about Amara's smile and the easy way they connected, he decided that whatever challenges might come, he wanted to see where this could go. Little did either of them know that their chance meeting would eventually change not just their lives, but the minds of those around them. Their first date at the bakery lasted 3 hours. James and Amara sat by the window, sharing stories between bites of pastry. He told her about his dream to design buildings that brought communities together. She showed him photos she had taken around the city, capturing moments most people missed. "You see things differently," James said, looking at a photo of children playing in a fountain. "I noticed structures, but you noticed the life inside them." As they left the bakery, James reached for Amara's hand. She took it, but she also noticed an elderly couple staring at their joined hands with disapproval. James saw it too, but squeezed her hand tighter. "Does that bother you?" she asked quietly. "The only thing that bothers me is that it might bother you," he replied. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a comfortable pattern. Tuesday nights, they tried new restaurants. Weekends, Amara showed James hidden spots perfect for photography around Boston. He began carrying her extra camera bag and learning about lighting and angles. 1 month into dating, James invited Amara to dinner with his friends. Mark, who James had known since college, greeted them at the restaurant with a too-white smile. "So nice to finally meet you," Mark said, his eyes moving quickly between them. "James hasn't stopped talking about you." During dinner, James's friends asked Amara polite questions about her work and family, but there was an uncomfortable edge to their curiosity. When James went to the bathroom, Mark leaned toward Amara. "So, is this like a serious thing between you two?" he asked. "We're still getting to know each other," Amara replied carefully. Right. It's just. James has always been kind of traditional. This is different for him." When Amara introduced James to her friends the following weekend, the reaction was equally mixed. Her friend Tasha pulled her into the kitchen while James chatted with the others. "He seems nice," Tasha admitted, "but are you ready for what comes with dating him? The stares? The questions?" "We get those already," Amara said. "But when we're together, it feels worth it." James met Amara's family at her younger brother's birthday party. Her mother, Lisa, welcomed him warmly but watched carefully how he interacted with everyone. Her father, Robert, asked direct questions about James's family and career. "My parents live in Connecticut now," James explained. "Dad's a retired lawyer, Mom teaches high school English." "Have you told them about Amara?" Robert asked bluntly. James nodded. "They're looking forward to meeting her." But when James arranged dinner with his parents the following month, their reactions weren't as positive as he claimed. His mother, Ellen, was polite but distant. His father, Thomas, asked Amara questions that felt like an interview. "So what neighborhood did you grow up in?" Thomas asked, his tone suggesting the answer mattered. "Dad," James warned. "It's a simple question," Thomas insisted. "I grew up in Roxbury," Amara answered. "My father is a postal worker, and my mother runs a daycare from our home." Ellen changed the subject quickly to safer topics. On the drive home, James apologized. "They'll come around. They just need time." "It's okay," Amara said, though they both knew it wasn't. "My parents weren't exactly thrilled at first either." Despite the challenges, something kept pulling them together. They found peace in each other's apartments, cooking dinner and talking about their days. When Amara had a photography exhibition at a small gallery, James brought flowers and stood proudly beside her all evening. When James completed a design for a community center, Amara was the first person he showed it to. 6 months into dating, James took Amara to the harbor at sunset. As boats moved slowly across the water, he turned to her. "I know it hasn't been easy," he said, "but being with you feels right in a way nothing else ever has." Amara looked at him, seeing past all the differences others focused on. "I feel the same way." They didn't know yet how much harder things would get, but in that moment, they both believed their love was strong enough to face whatever came next. 9 months into their relationship, James started visiting jewelry stores on his lunch breaks. He knew Amara preferred simple designs over flashy ones. After weeks of searching, he found a ring with a modest diamond set in rose gold. Elegant but not extravagant. James planned everything carefully. He booked a weekend trip to Martha's Vineyard, where Amara had always wanted to visit. They stayed in a small bed and breakfast with a view of the ocean. On their second day, he suggested a walk along the beach at sunset. The sky turned orange and pink as they walked barefoot in the sand. James had rehearsed his speech many times, but when the moment came, the words stuck in his throat. "Are you okay?" Amara asked, noticing how quiet he had become. "You seem nervous." James stopped walking and took both her hands in his. "I am nervous," he admitted, "because what I'm about to ask will change everything." He dropped to one knee in the sand. Amara's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. "Amara Wilson, I know we've only known each other for 9 months. I know people think we're too different. But when I'm with you, everything makes sense. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Amara's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes." James slipped the ring onto her finger, and they embraced as the waves crashed nearby. For that perfect moment, nothing else mattered, not the differences in their backgrounds, not what others might say. Reality crashed back when they returned to Boston and began sharing their news. Amara called her parents first, putting the phone on speaker so James could hear. "You're engaged?" her mother asked, her voice tight with surprise. "It's only been 9 months, Amara." "When you know, you know," Amara replied, squeezing James's hand. "Have you thought about what this means?" her father asked. "Marriage is hard enough without adding more challenges. If you're talking about us being an interracial couple, we deal with that every day already," Amara said firmly. "We just want you to be happy." Her mother sighed. and we worry this path won't be easy." James's parents reacted with similar concern. His mother suggested they were rushing things. His father asked pointed questions about where they would live and how they would raise children. "Children?" James repeated. "We just got engaged, Dad." "These are things you need to consider," his father insisted. "Will they look more like you or more like her? Have you thought about what that means?" James ended the call feeling angry and disappointed. "I'm sorry," he told Amara. "I thought they would be more supportive." "At least they're being honest," Amara replied. "Better to know where they stand now." When they announced their engagement at work, the reactions were mixed. Some colleagues offered genuine congratulations. Others showed surprise they couldn't quite hide. James's boss clapped him on the back and said, "Bold move, Henderson," in a tone that could be interpreted multiple ways. One evening, James met his friend Mark for drinks. He'd hoped his oldest friend would finally show some support. "I'm happy if you're happy," Mark said carefully, "but are you sure you're not just trying to make some kind of statement? You've always been the guy who wants to change the world." "I'm marrying the woman I love," James said, his voice hard. "Not making a political statement." Amara faced similar questions from her friends. Tasha organized a small engagement party, but during the celebration, she pulled Amara aside. "I support you," Tasha said, "but have you really thought about what you're signing up for? The stares every time you go out? The assumptions people will make?" "We're not naive," Amara replied. "We know it won't be easy, but why should we let other people's prejudice stop us from being happy?" Despite the doubts and questions from nearly everyone in their lives, James and Amara began planning their wedding. They decided on a small ceremony, inviting only those who truly supported their relationship. One night, as they addressed invitation envelopes, Amara looked up at James. "Sometimes I wonder if we're crazy, pushing forward when everyone seems to think we're making a mistake." James put down his pen and took her hand. "Maybe we are, but I'd rather be crazy with you than play it safe without you." Amara smiled, the doubt in her eyes fading. Together, they continued writing names on envelopes, building their future one invitation at a time. The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect weather. James and Amara had chosen a small venue by Boston Harbor, where the water sparkled under the May sunshine. They had invited only 60 guests, hoping a smaller gathering would feel more intimate and supportive. In the bridal suite, Amara sat before a mirror while her mother adjusted her veil. The simple white dress hugged her figure before flowing out at the knees. She had chosen yellow roses for her bouquet, the same color as the wildflowers that had been blooming when James proposed. "You look beautiful," her mother said, their eyes meeting in the mirror. "Are you still worried?" Amara asked. Her mother sighed. "I'll always worry about you facing a harder path, but seeing how he looks at you, I believe your James truly loves you." Meanwhile, in a room across the hall, James adjusted his tie for the third time. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. His father entered, closing the door behind him. "Son, I need to say something," Thomas began. "Your mother and we haven't been as supportive as we should have been." James turned to face his father, surprised by this unexpected admission. "We were raised differently," Thomas continued. "But that's no excuse. Today is your wedding day, and we want you to know we're here for both of you, completely." James hugged his father tightly, too moved for words. At 2 o'clock, guests gathered on white chairs facing the harbor. James stood at the altar, watching as family and friends filled the seats. He noticed several empty spaces, people who had RSVP'd, but apparently decided not to come. The music began, and everyone turned to watch Amara walk down the aisle on her father's arm. James felt tears form in his eyes at the sight of her. In that moment, all the difficulties they had faced seemed small compared to the joy of seeing his bride approach. When the officiant asked, "Who gives this woman?" Amara's father paused just slightly before saying, "Her mother and I do." Then he placed Amara's hand in James's and stepped back. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. They had written their own vows, promising not only love and faithfulness but also courage and partnership in facing whatever challenges came their way. "With this ring, I promise to stand beside you," James said, "even when the world doesn't understand what we found together." "With this ring, I promise to build a home with you," Amara replied. "That will be a refuge for both of us, no matter what waits outside our door." As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, most of the guests applauded warmly. A few clapped with uncertain expressions, still not completely comfortable with what they were witnessing. During the reception, the couple's first dance brought genuine smiles from both families. The champagne flowed, the music played, and for a while, it seemed everyone had set aside their doubts to celebrate love. But reality couldn't be completely avoided. James overheard his uncle talking to a cousin near the bar. Wonder what their kids will look like. Bet they'll be confused, not fitting in anywhere. At another table, Amara noticed her cousin speaking to a friend. I don't know why she couldn't find a nice black man. Is she trying to make some kind of point? Yet for every hurtful comment, there were moments of true support. James's college roommate made a heartfelt toast about love that crosses boundaries. Amara's grandmother, who had initially been the most vocal with concerns, pulled James aside and pressed something into his palm. This was my wedding handkerchief, she told him. I want you to have it for your family. As the night ended, the newlyweds slipped away to a waiting car decorated with ribbons and "Just Married" written on the back window. Inside the car, Amara kicked off her painful shoes with a sigh of relief. Well, we did it, she said, leaning against James's shoulder. Despite everything. Was it what you hoped for? He asked, suddenly worried about all the small tensions they'd noticed throughout the day. Amara looked back at the venue where their families were still mingling, some awkwardly, some with genuine warmth beginning to show. It was real, she answered. And that's better than perfect. They drove away toward their honeymoon, leaving behind a room full of people who were just beginning to see that perhaps their love wasn't so strange after all. The first few weeks of marriage passed in a happy blur. After returning from their honeymoon in Puerto Rico, James and Amara moved into their new home, a fixer-upper in a diverse neighborhood between their two former communities. The house needed work, but it had character with its old wooden floors and large windows that let in plenty of light. I think the kitchen should be our first project, Amara said one morning as they sat drinking coffee at the wobbly table. This countertop has seen better days. James nodded, already sketching ideas on a napkin. We could knock out this wall, open everything up. They spent weekends painting walls and evenings shopping for furniture. Their different tastes sometimes caused debates. James preferred modern, clean lines while Amara loved vintage pieces with history. But they always found compromises that somehow worked better than either original idea. 3 months after the wedding, James took a big step in his career. He left his architecture firm to start his own small practice, focusing on community buildings and affordable housing projects. The timing was risky, but Amara supported his decision completely. You've been talking about this since we met, she reminded him. If not now, when? His first client was a nonprofit organization looking to convert an old warehouse into a community arts center. The budget was tight, but the project excited him more than any luxury condo development ever had. Meanwhile, Amara's photography business grew steadily. She began a personal project photographing families in their neighborhood, capturing the diversity and connections that existed there. Each portrait came with a story, told in the family's own words about their lives and experiences. These are powerful, James said when she showed him the first collection. You're doing something important here. Not everything was smooth sailing. James's parents visited their new home and made comments about the neighborhood being in transition. At a dinner party, one of Amara's colleagues asked James if he'd always been into black culture, as if his marriage were a phase or fetish. They learned to handle these moments together, sometimes confronting ignorance directly, other times choosing to walk away. Each incident strengthened their bond rather than weakening it. 6 months into marriage, they hosted their first Thanksgiving. Both families gathered around their dining table, which James had built himself from reclaimed wood. The conversation started awkwardly, with polite small talk and careful avoidance of certain topics. Then Amara's younger brother asked James's sister about her job teaching in Chicago, and they discovered a shared passion for education reform. James's mother complimented Amara's mother on her sweet potato pie recipe, which led to an exchange of family cooking stories. By dessert, Thomas and Robert were arguing good-naturedly about baseball teams. Look at them, Amara whispered to James in the kitchen as they prepared coffee. Who would have thought? It's a start, James replied, kissing her forehead. Not everyone changed their minds so quickly. Some friends drifted away, invitations to certain social circles stopped coming, and they occasionally heard about comments made behind their backs. A few of James's clients seemed uncomfortable meeting Amara at office events. One of Amara's aunts continued to ask when she would come to her senses. But for every relationship lost, new ones formed. Their home became a gathering place for other couples and friends who valued connection across differences. They hosted dinner parties where conversations flowed freely about everything from politics to art to family traditions. One evening, as they sat on their newly finished back deck watching fireflies, Amara asked James, "Do you ever regret it? All the complications that came with us being together?" James took her hand, running his thumb over her wedding ring. "Not for a single second." "Do you?" "Never," she replied. "But I do wonder what comes next for us." Neither could have predicted how their next chapter would unfold, or how their love story would soon challenge those who had doubted them most. 9 months into their marriage, James and Amara were settling into a comfortable routine when news broke that shook their community. The historical community center in Roxbury, where Amara had attended after-school programs as a child, was scheduled for demolition. A developer had purchased the property and planned to build luxury apartments. The building, originally constructed in the 1930s, had structural issues but remained a vital resource for local families. Budget cuts had prevented necessary repairs for years, giving the developer an opening to purchase the property. "Let me see what I can find out," James said, already reaching for his phone. The next day, James visited the center, walking through halls filled with children's artwork and faded photographs of community events. The director, Mrs. Jackson, a woman in her 60s who had run the place for 20 years, gave him a tour. "So you're Amara Wilson's husband," she said, studying him. "She was always taking pictures around here. Had an eye for it even back then." "We want to help save this place," James explained. "I'm an architect. Maybe there's a way to renovate instead of demolish." Mrs. Jackson looked skeptical. "Why would you care about our community center?" "Because it matters to my wife," James answered simply. "And because places like this should be protected, not torn down." That evening, James and Amara sat at their dining table with notebooks and laptops. They began researching everything from historical preservation grants to community fundraising options. James sketched preliminary renovation plans that would preserve the building's character while addressing its structural issues. "We need to get community support," Amara said. "People who have history with the center." They organized a meeting at the local library. Amara expected 20 people might show up. Instead, more than 50 crowded into the room, including former center attendees, parents, and longtime residents. James presented his ideas for renovation, showing slides of how the building could be preserved while being made safer and more functional. "That all sounds nice," one man said, "but who's going to pay for it? And why should we trust you with our community center?" The question hung in the air. James looked at Amara, unsure how to respond. Amara stood up. "Many of you know me. This center was my second home growing up. James is my husband, and yes, he's not from this neighborhood, but he's offering his professional skills to help save something important to all of us." "Still doesn't answer who's paying," someone called out. "We'll find the money," James said confidently. "Historic preservation grants, community fundraising, corporate sponsorships. If we work together, we can make this happen." After the meeting, opinions were divided. Some welcomed the help. Others questioned James's motives and Amara's loyalty to her community. Comments circulated about the white architect trying to save the hood, and about Amara using her husband's privilege. Despite the resistance, they pushed forward. James worked nights and weekends developing detailed plans. Amara started a photo project documenting the center's history, interviewing former attendees and staff about what the place meant to them. They established a committee of local residents to guide the renovation plans. James listened carefully to their input, adjusting his designs to reflect community needs rather than imposing his vision. 3 months into the project, they received their first major breakthrough, a historic preservation grant that would cover 30% of the renovation costs. The news brought cautious optimism, but they still needed much more funding. Amara organized an exhibition of her photographs at a downtown gallery, telling the center's story through images and personal narratives. The opening night drew an unexpected crowd, including several potential donors. James' parents attended, seeing for the first time the community that had shaped their daughter-in-law. I had no idea how much history was here, Ellen said, studying a photograph of children playing in the center's yard in the 1950s. Even as support grew, challenges remained. The developer fought their efforts with legal maneuvers. Some community members still viewed James with suspicion, questioning whether his plans would ultimately change the center's character and accessibility. At a tense community meeting, Mrs. Jackson finally stood up. "I've watched these two work tirelessly for months," she said, gesturing to James and Amara. "They're not doing this for themselves. They're doing it for us. Maybe it's time we stopped questioning their motives and started helping them save our center." Her words marked a turning point. The community began to truly unite behind the project, setting the stage for what would become James and Amara's greatest challenge and triumph. As their first wedding anniversary approached, James and Amara faced their biggest challenge yet. Despite securing the preservation grant, they still needed to raise an additional $300,000 to save the community center. The deadline set by the developer was just 2 months away. "We need something big," James said one evening as they reviewed their fundraising progress. "Something that will get attention beyond the neighborhood." Amara sat quietly for a moment, then reached for her laptop. "What if we show people what this place could be? Not just with your drawings, but with stories?" She pulled up her photo collection, which had grown to include not just historical images but portraits of current children who used the center, paired with their dreams for the future. "We could create a virtual tour," she suggested. "Your architectural designs alongside my photos and the children's stories." They worked through the night, combining James's digital renderings with Amara's photographs. By morning, they had created a powerful presentation that showed not just a building, but a living community space that bridged past and future. Amara contacted a former journalism professor who now worked at the Boston Globe. The next Sunday, their story appeared on the front page of the lifestyle section. "Couple fights to save historic community center." The article featured their journey, including how they had overcome prejudice in their personal lives to work together professionally. The response was immediate. Emails and calls poured in from people wanting to help. A local tech company offered to match donations up to $50,000. Former center attendees who had moved away sent checks with notes about what the place had meant to them. What surprised them most was the changing attitude of those who had initially opposed them. James's colleague Mark, who had questioned their marriage, called to offer his firm's services for electrical work at cost. Amara's cousin, who had made comments at their wedding, organized a fundraising dinner at his restaurant. Even James's parents, who had been politely distant since the wedding, made a significant donation. "We want to be part of what you're building," his mother said when she called with the news. The community center project was changing more than just a building. It was changing hearts and minds. As the fundraising deadline approached, they were still $75,000 short. James and Amara decided to host an open house at the center itself, inviting everyone who had expressed interest to see the space and the community it served. The night before the event, as they hung Amara's photographs around the old gymnasium, Mrs. Jackson approached them. "I need to tell you something," she said. "When you first showed up, James, I thought you were just some white man trying to look good by helping the black community. And Amara, I wondered if you'd forgotten where you came from." She paused, emotion showing on her face. "I was wrong about both of you. What you're doing here is real." The open house drew over 300 people, including several who had laughed or made comments about their relationship. Local businesses brought food, children from the center performed a short play about its history, and Amara's photos and James's designs were displayed side by side. By the end of the night, they had received enough pledges to exceed their goal. The community center would be saved. 2 years after their wedding day, James and Amara stood together at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the renovated center. The building maintained its historical character, but now had modern facilities, improved accessibility, and new programs including a photography studio named after Amara's first mentor. Looking out at the crowd, they saw faces that once showed doubt now beaming with pride and support. James' parents stood beside Amara's family, all wearing t-shirts with the center's new logo that James had designed. "We did it," Amara whispered, squeezing James's hand. "We all did it together," he replied. After the ceremony, several people approached them with apologies. "I judged you too quickly," said one of Amara's childhood friends. "I thought your marriage was a mistake. Now I see what you've created together." Mark pulled James aside. Remember when I asked if you were making a statement? Turns out you were. Just not the one I thought. You showed us what's possible when people work together." As they walked home that evening, James and Amara reflected on how much had changed. 2 years ago, people laughed at us, Amara said. Now they're asking how they can help. Maybe that's what we were meant to do all along, James replied. Not just build a life together, but build bridges for others. The center they saved was just the beginning of what their partnership would accomplish. 3 years after their wedding day, James and Amara sat on the rooftop garden of the community center they had saved. Below them, families gathered for the center's annual summer festival. Children ran through sprinklers while parents chatted in the shade of newly planted trees. The center now operated at full capacity with waiting lists for many of its programs. "Remember how nervous we were on our first date?" Amara asked, leaning against James's shoulder. "I was terrified you'd notice my hands shaking when I passed you that coffee," he admitted with a laugh. So much had changed since then. The successful renovation of the community center had made James a small architecture firm well known in Boston. He now received requests from other neighborhoods wanting similar community-focused projects. Amara's photography exhibit of the center's history had traveled to 3 museums and launched her career in a new direction, documenting community spaces across the city. Their personal lives had transformed as well. The families that once questioned their relationship now gathered at their home for holidays and celebrations. James's parents had become regular volunteers at the center's literacy program. Amara's father and James had started a weekend workshop teaching young people basic carpentry skills. "James, Amara, there you are," called Mrs. Jackson as she climbed the stairs to the roof garden. "The mayor just arrived. He wants to talk to you both about expanding the program to other neighborhoods." This was the latest development in their journey. The mayor had proposed creating similar community hubs throughout Boston, using their center as a model. The plan would combine historic preservation with modern community needs, just as James and Amara had done. As they walked downstairs to meet the mayor, they passed the wall of photographs Amara had created. Images spanning the center's 70-year history, including recent photos of children enjoying the renovated spaces. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, the mayor greeted them, using Amara's married name, which she used professionally now though she had kept Wilson legally. "What you've accomplished here is remarkable. We need this kind of community investment across the city." After discussing the mayor's proposal, they mingled with the festival attendees. Many were faces they now knew well: families who used the center, donors who had supported their campaign, volunteers who helped with programs. Mark approached them with his new girlfriend, a woman who taught dance classes at the center. "I'm thinking of moving to this neighborhood," he told James. "Never thought I'd say that 2 years ago." Amara's cousin, who had made that hurtful comment at their wedding, now ran a successful catering business that provided free meals for the center's after-school program. "You two proved me wrong," he said simply when they complimented his latest dish. Later that evening, they hosted a small dinner at their home for the center's staff and key volunteers. As they raised glasses in celebration, Mrs. Jackson stood to make a toast. "When these two first got together, people talked," she said, looking around the table. "Some laughed, some questioned, some made predictions about failure. We all know who we were and what we said back then." She paused. "And now, we all regret those words. Because what James and Amara showed us wasn't just about saving a building. They showed us what happens when we look past our differences and work together." After their guests left, James and Amara walked through their home, now filled with photographs, artwork, and mementos from their journey together. On the mantel sat a framed newspaper clipping of the article that had helped save the center, alongside their wedding photo. "Did you ever imagine this is where we'd end up?" James asked, wrapping his arms around Amara from behind. "Honestly, no," she answered. "I hoped we'd be happy together, but I never thought we'd change so many minds." The next day, they received an unexpected letter. It was from a young interracial couple who had visited the center. "Seeing what you built together gives us hope," the letter read. "Not just for our relationship, but for the community we want to be part of. Thank you for showing us what's possible." James pinned the letter to their kitchen bulletin board. "Maybe that's our real legacy," he said. "Not the building, but the example." Amara nodded. From being the couple everyone laughed at, to the couple that showed them another way. Outside their window, the diverse neighborhood they had chosen continued its daily life. Children played, Neighbors chatted, and the community center they had saved stood as a monument not just to history preserved, but to prejudice overcome. They had built something lasting, not just a marriage or a building, but a bridge between communities that would continue long after their story was told.